Hello, I'm Richard Velleman and I'm one of the founders of the Five-Step Method. Welcome to our Five-Step Method discussion on Step 3, which is all about exploring how a family member responds and copes with their situation. So I'd like to introduce our panel today. We have Richard McVeigh, who's Aquarius's Head of Services. And Aquarius is a charity which runs a range of services across the Midlands in England, supporting people affected by alcohol, drugs and gambling and their families. Many of you will recognize Richard from our original Five-Step Method DVD or clips from it, where he demonstrated using the Five-Step Method. And these demonstrations were made over 10 years ago, but they're still just as valid today. Next, we have Pauline Stewart, who is the Executive Officer and founder of Family Drug Support in New Zealand. Pauline is a Five-Step Method practitioner, assessor and trainer. Now we have Steve Staunton, who works in New Zealand and is a Five-Step Method practitioner, assessor, trainer and assessor of trainers. And finally, we have Megan O'Leary, who was the development worker for the National Family Support Network in Ireland and who introduced the Five-Step Method across Ireland. And Megan is also a Five-Step Method practitioner, assessor and trainer. So we're going to start today by finding out what the panel have seen that is evidence of good delivery in Step 3 in the Five-Step Method, and what this means for both the practitioner and the affected family member. So can I start with asking you, Richard, about what makes good delivery?
Thanks, Richard. I think it's really important when we're looking at the different coping styles, the three main coping styles that we talk about within the Five-Step Method. As practitioners, we really need to be aware of what our own personal coping style is. You know, if we're looking at an engaged style, tolerant style, or withdrawal style, when we're looking at this, we need to be very aware of what our natural inclinations are within our own, within our own life. I think why that's really important is to make sure that we're not either consciously or unconsciously encouraging or trying to influence which coping style the family member uses when we work with them. I think my sense is that my observations from supervising and training a lot of people is those of us that are attracted to the helping professions sometimes may have a bit of an inclination towards being helpers or an engaged style, but there are other occasions where people may have inclinations towards the other two styles as well. And I think it's really important that we own that and make sure that we're very neutral in the way that we're trying to approach styles of the family members, so that we're giving a free choice really and trying to help them be as sophisticated in their choices to all the situations they might be facing. And then secondly, extending that point is really working with the family member so that they're aware of their own, perhaps their default coping style. Often when we're explaining the three different coping styles and we give examples, we're asking the family member, which of those styles do you recognize, in your own life? And they may often well say, I use all of them at different times. However, it's important we probe a bit further. And when we're stressed, we often tend to kind of have a particular way of coping that will tend to be more instinctive. I think it's really important that family members kind of switch into that and know which might be their most, their default really when they're stressed, so that they have that awareness around their coping style. A second really important point is we need to be aware of a cultural context in which coping responses happen and people's choices. A lot of family members are under cultural pressure to respond in particular ways. And examples of that, is for example, having worked with, we often see in terms of who may present first, may well be women within the family, in terms of being, often the cultural norms about who is the carer or who he takes that responsibility within the family. Often they may well feel that there's pressure for a tolerant coping style, that they're the one that has to clean up the messes or look after the person. And I guess there may be a real pressure for them in terms of, or difficulties then at looking at a different coping style because of expectations of other people around them. Or another occasion, I guess I've got an example where I was working with a family member, and it was almost like a societal view that they'd taken, that what you need to do with a drug user is berate them. You need to tell them off. That's the way you get people to change. And she was kind of a bit dumbfounded, like when I said, you don't have to do that. That's not how we necessarily work, you know. And actually opening the person up to see that there are different ways of coping, but they felt that's kind of what people do. And finally, just another one point I wanted to make really around, you know, sort of using the looking at coping styles. Is making sure it's practical, not just theoretical. I think it's great that we explain about the 3 different coping styles, but we really need to make sure we ask the family member to talk about situations that they've responded to, practical situations and dilemmas they have in their daily life, and to look at situations they may well be facing in the present or future, so that we can apply the theory to real life practice to kind of really embed their understanding of what the coping styles are.
Richard, thank you very much indeed. That was really clear and very helpful. A lot of very important points there. Can I move on to Pauline and ask you what you've seen in terms of good practice and good delivery?
Thank you, Richard. Obviously, every step in the 5-step is crucial, but I really feel that and see when I'm assessing that step 3 is the heart of change. And that's why it's really, really important that this step isn't rushed. Sometimes even you might need 2 step 3s, because step 3 is about the family member looking at the way they're coping in a way that allows them to give very specific examples. The whole step should be based on very specific examples, not generalizations. And one of the things that we use is a visual representation of the 3 different steps and the advantages and disadvantages. And when we're asking the family members what sort of how they've dealt with particular situations, and then we get them to see whereabouts they'd fit into these three different types of coping styles. One of the things family members often say is, I don't know whether I'm doing this right. I don't know whether I'm reacting the right way. And when they know that there are actually basically only 3 styles, that gives them a lot of relief, because then they can look forward to considering what style they're using whenever they have to make a decision. So getting very specific examples and then finding out where they fit into these 3 categories is very, very important. And that definitely can't be rushed. You need lots of examples from the family member, not the practitioner telling them all the time, but the family members coming up with their understanding of where they are.
Thank you, Pauline. That's really very helpful. And I think your view that step 3 is at the heart of the 5-step method is one I think we'd probably all agree with. It may be the first time that people realize that they have a choice. And one of our duties, one of the really important parts in the 5-step method is helping people who may feel very stuck and may feel they have absolutely no choices to realize that actually there are always choices. It's the Tina versus Tar bit, which is at the heart of that, isn't it? Okay, let me move on please to Steve. And Steve, what do you think are examples of good practice or good delivery?
Sorry, I just had to unmute me. The button wasn't actually working. Thank you for that, Richard. Yeah, I think to really, it's been touched on a couple of times already, but it's the importance of being really specific when asking about how the family member copes. To give an example of the behavior of the is it the family member with the substance problem or the gambling problem? And then to think about or encourage the family member to think about what they do in that situation, in that very specific situation, and obviously explore the advantages and disadvantages, and to get more than just one of each. But then also to be gently encouraging family members to think about what else could you do, and what else could you do, and what else could you do? Almost be like a broken record, but not a patronizing broken record, but just to always be encouraging them to think about another way of responding. If they find it hard to actually think of any other way of responding, sometimes it's useful for us, and more experienced practitioners can do this better, is that we can offer ideas about what other family members have tried in similar situations. And then we can suggest that the family member consider what they might think are the advantages and disadvantages of responding in that particular way. So I think that's my first example of good practice. Another one would be that a practitioner needs to be patient with family members who seem to perhaps persist or only see one particular preferred response. And Richard touched on this before about sometimes in crisis or in situations of stress, we tend to always go back to the same way that we've done it before. So it's really encouraging family members to think about, so what are the advantages and disadvantages of that preferred response? But then also the gentle encouragement again about, so what would be another way that you could respond here? So it's all about developing a more flexible and even sophisticated approach towards responding. And this ties into another example of good practice from the practitioner. It's about encouraging the family member to actually experiment and to try different things, knowing that there is no right or wrong, there are just different disadvantages and advantages of each way. So it's about giving them permission to try something new and to see what happens and to explore what happens. All about, as Pauline had mentioned, to kind of remind family members that we actually have a choice. We don't always have to keep doing the same thing we've always done. And that in the next session, the family member can come back and tell us what it was like trying a different response. And again, let's explore the advantages and disadvantages. And perhaps the final piece of the good practice puzzle is being aware and being able to identify when a family member's engaged response may actually be moving beyond the point of what is helpful and perhaps becoming abusive towards their family member. For example, shouting at them or belittling them or putting in responses that control them. So as a practitioner, what we need to do is actually express concern about the behaviours and the aspects of them and really focus on the advantages and disadvantages, perhaps not just for them as the family member, but the person with the substance problem or the gambling problem too, so that they can then perhaps understand if there is a negative impact from their more perhaps abusive responses, that they can see that that's happening. And always we need to be mindful that if perhaps some of those engaged responses lead us to be concerned for the safety of anyone in the family, that we need to take steps to check that out, do a risk assessment and come up with a safety plan.
Steve, thank you. A lot of extremely important and very thoughtful comments there. Thank you very much. Let me move on to Megan and ask you for what your opinion is about good delivery or good practice that you've seen.
I've seen some great practice of step threes over the years, and I guess these are some of the basic tips that I've gained from listening to some really good step three sessions. And I think what is really helpful for a lot of practitioners out there who are maybe going through the accreditation process right now or thinking of it is that a lot of work can be done pre-step three to make it a good step three. So it means kind of doing the prep work, doing your homework before you kind of get into that room to work through step three with the family member. So first and foremost, I would say for practitioners starting out on the assessment process is make sure you understand the typology. know it yourself, know it inside out, make sure you're really familiar with the 3 different coping styles, make sure that you have common examples or typical example of each coping style that you can draw on really quickly if a family member is struggling to understand the typology or to relate the typology to their own lives. So that would be one tip for me. Just make sure you're really familiar with the typology and you have your typical examples ready. Some step 3s, and the most successful step 3s are where the practitioner works with the family member to support them to identify their preferred coping style or their default coping style or the one that they rely on the most. Sometimes it can happen where people have looked at, maybe the practitioners have looked at the family member questionnaire, they've done step 1 and step 2 with the family member, and they have a very good insight into potentially what coping style the family member uses. But unfortunately, rather than empower the family member to come to that realization or decision themselves as their preferred coping style, they nearly diagnose the family member with the coping style, which again is a route that we certainly don't want to go down in terms of disempowering family members or potentially family members feeling labeled in any way. So I think it's really important that while you do your preparatory work, you look at the family member questionnaire, you listen to step 1 and step 2 again, so that you have kind of typical stressful situations that family members are going through ready to support them through step 3 if needed, and that you don't necessarily diagnose the coping style for the family member. And also, I think the really successful step 3s that I've listened to are where family members have done step 3 in advance of coming in, as in they've done step 3 in the handbook before they've come in to do step 3 with the practitioner, and that's been really helpful because they themselves then are ready and familiar with the typology and ways of coping. Or where practitioners are confident enough to use the exercises that are in the handbook during step 3 to give them a structure within the session. I say it about every step, but I'll say it again about step 3, and perhaps it is the most important because step 3 is a bit trickier than some of the other steps, is to set it up well. Tell the family member what the purpose of the session is, have a really easy explanation of the typology of coping ready for the family member. And also, a lot of practitioners say from the outset there is no right or wrong way of coping to family members, which is great, but the really good practitioners reassure the family member throughout the session that there is no right or wrong way to cope. And I think a lot of family members know theoretically, maybe potentially in their heads, that there is no right or wrong way to cope, but they need that reassurance during the session when you're telling someone how difficult it is for you and how you've been responding in a really stressful situation. You need the person working with you in front of you to reassure you and reiterate that to you again. And then I think the beauty of 5-step is that it's about the family member and what works for the family member and what's going to reduce the stress of the family member, the strain. And I think it's so important that when you're setting up step 3 and you're working with family member through step 3, you're saying it's about actually what works for you. So we're looking at ways of responding and what are the advantages to you in your way of responding and what are the disadvantages to you in your way of responding. Because so many family members are responding in ways that they think are for the benefit of the drug user, the alcohol user. They're responding so that they might be more effective in supporting them to get into treatment or more effective in maintaining their sobriety or whatever it may be, but they're not responding in ways that actually might be most advantageous to them as a family member. So I think it's really important for practitioners to try to work with family members to change family members' mindset as such, nearly that actually this is about you and I want to know what works best for you, not necessarily what works best for other family members or for the drug using family member. And then lastly, and it's sort of on that note, I think there's huge potential within step 3 to increase understanding within the family, because suddenly you're going in as a family member and you're hearing about this typology of coping and you're suddenly thinking that potentially maybe your partner isn't told or he doesn't care or he doesn't love our son or daughter the way that I do. It's actually that he's using a withdrawal or gaining independence coping response, whereas I'm a much more engaged coper. But actually we're both coming from a place of love. We're both under a massive amount of stress. We're both really struggling with this. And we're just responding in very different ways for different reasons. But actually, I think it can really provide an impetus maybe and a potential to get more understanding within relationships within the family.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you, panel, for a very comprehensive look at what makes good practice and the examples you've seen in your work of what makes really good practice in step 3. Let me move to the second question, which we're going to look at today, which is about common problems that we've seen in the delivery of step 3 and how we might overcome them. I'm going to turn to Richard first, as I know that you're going to talk a little bit about structure, how you structure the session, and about some other general points. So let me turn to Richard first.
Thank you, Richard. I think as the panel have described very accurately, is step 3, looking at responding and coping, can be a hugely powerful intervention for family members. It can be a key aspect of behavioural change, which is a pretty fundamental change for family members to make in response to some of these alcohol, drugs or gambling. I think one of the problems is, and that can be faced with as a practitioner in implementing step 3, is rushing it in the sense of not really giving enough time within the session at the start to be describing the 3 different styles, giving a clear explanation of what each of them are and the distinction between them, and providing sufficient examples for the family member to actually get that. So for me, there's a sense of, as well as, is really to make sure that you're checking their understanding before you then move on to sort of like practical application and looking at how the family member might use these styles. We really need to make sure that we've provided sufficient information and check their understanding. Have they got it? Because it really is kind of like the foundation stone to actually moving on to practical application. So that really is down to preparation, making sure that you're ready to do that, you understand and provide sufficient explanation. And the way around that, is really providing that sufficient explanation with examples and checking the understanding. The second aspect, really, one of the problems is sometimes people, without that preparation, jump straight into asking how somebody has coped. How have you been coping? And really, without really explaining the purpose of the session and kind of providing that structure. And I think that, again, sometimes that can come through inexperience in terms of just jumping straight into the topic without necessarily setting the scene, explaining why this particular step, looking at responding and coping, is really important and how it can be beneficial, and setting that agenda from the start, providing a structure to the session. I think that can be a kind of a potential problem, but avoided if we do set the agenda out for the session and provide the opportunity for looking at those looking at the information about the coping styles before we jump into the practicalities.
Richard, thank you very much indeed. Megan, you were also going to say something, I think, about general things and structure. So can I pass over to you?
Yes, I mean, I just want to echo really what Richard said there, which is basically to do your prep work, listen back to step 1 and step 2, look at the exercises in the handbook again before you start step 3, and then also take that time. And it's much better to take the time at the start with the family member to explain the purpose of the step, what you're going to look at today, explain the typology to the family member, so that then actually the rest of the session can flow much more easily. And that the family member feels guided through step 3, and they feel that the structure of it, you're going to guide the family member through it, and therefore the family member feels, okay, well, now I can kind of relax and take the opportunity to reflect on my coping styles, because I'm not in charge of the session and how it's going to be structured today. The practitioner is in charge of that, and I feel facilitated then just to relax and reflect on my own situation. But I think, structuring taking that 5 minutes, taking that 10 minutes at the start to really help the family member understand what you're going to cover today is essential.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Megan. I want to move on to problems that people have seen about getting examples, specific examples about current coping. And I know that both Pauline and Megan, you've got something to say about that. Let me turn to Pauline first. Pauline, what problems have you seen about getting specific examples, and how can we overcome them?
Thank you, Richard. I think it's quite often appropriate to go back to the family member questionnaire and remember and remind the family member about some of the things that you've talked about when you've done the family member questionnaire, because they're very practical examples and they relate to what the person has said. So that's often the problem is that people often don't go back to the family member questionnaire. Also, some people are visual learners and some people are auditory learners, and I think for me, I think it's really important that practitioners have a visual in front of the family member, because it's really hard for people to keep on taking information in when they're trying to think about examples. I think it's also really important that the family member realises that this is based, step 3 is based on really sound research, and that the research came from the bottom up. It came from family members and the ways they were coping. And I often say, you know, there was 150 ways that people said they cope, but actually they came down to 3. And when people know that there are only 3 ways to cope, then that gives them a lot of confidence to try something new. So, for example, one of the common problems I feel is that people don't see withdrawal as a really good strategy, because often they're so engaged or they're so tolerating of what's going on, they see withdrawal as not doing anything. So I think being able to show that withdrawal is a really good strategy will give people confidence to be able to try a lot more things. And when they see these working, then they can actually look at these 3 strategies and say, actually, I could try all of these. So I think those are some of the common problems, just really specifically not getting examples of all the ways of coping, and realise these are the only ways of coping.
Pauline, thank you very much. Megan, is there anything you want to add about current coping and specific examples?
Just to say, it's that piece again of really excellent practitioners have internalized the typology. They know it inside and out, and more than that, Richard, they understand it. So they can really relate as to why a family member may choose to select a certain coping style. They understand what advantages people are getting from engaged coping or withdrawal or gaining independence or tolerant coping. And therefore, they can empathize and support people kind of to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of that. And I think also it goes back to that homework again. They have stressful specific examples that the family members have mentioned in steps 1 and 2 ready, that if the family member is struggling to kind of come up with a specific scenario and is talking in very general terms about how they cope, they can say, well, do you remember in step 1 when you told me about when he or she comes home in the evening and how you often get into that argument or fight? And we look at that as a specific way of responding. So they have them ready if the family member is speaking in more general terms.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Megan. You're absolutely right. Of course, preparation and remembering what people have said in previous sessions, and as Pauline said, using the FMQ as a way of bringing up what people have said about coping situations are absolutely vital, aren't they? Let me move on to Steve. I know, Steve, you wanted to talk both about advantages and disadvantages and how we get them and use them, and what are the problems when people don't do that, and also about there being no right or wrong way of coping. So can I pass over to you, Steve?
Yep, certainly. Thanks, Richard. So yeah, I suppose the main problem about advantages and disadvantages is when people don't ask about them. And certainly having a good starting point of specific examples gives us a good opportunity to start exploring advantages and disadvantages. But sometimes the problem is that we might only ask for one advantage and one disadvantage. And by asking only one of each makes it really, really hard to have a discussion or to make this part of step 3 about empowering the family member with options. Because if the advantages equal the disadvantages, how can a family member feel more empowered or actually think, oh, is this the right decision for me? It can leave them in a position of confusion. So it's really about asking, and what's another advantage, and what else? And again, I think I mentioned it before, sounding like a broken record without actually sounding like a broken record. But we also need to be really mindful, taking Richard's point from earlier, that we're not biasing how we explore advantages and disadvantages by what we would see as our own coping style or coping response. So it really is about the advantages and disadvantages, getting lots of them, so that and lots of them for the way they respond and for the alternatives, and so that the family member can then look at it as a whole, and then be able to, this is good decision making, where we look at advantages and disadvantages, not just of one option, but of all of our options, so that then we're in a better position to decide what is the way that works best for me. And again, this is really important, and I think Pauline and I think Megan have both kind of talked about it. It's about the family members at the centre of this. So it has to be their advantages and their disadvantages. So bringing it back to them. So that's the bit of, I suppose, common problems around advantages and disadvantages. And it does sort of tie in with the competency criteria 3.4, which is about the practitioner helping the family member to understand there is no right or wrong. All there is more advantages, more disadvantages. That's the I suppose the typology of decision making, or how a family member can perhaps judge their own decision making. And picking up on points that were made before, it's that it's not enough that we say it only once. That every chance we get, we need to regularly reassure that there is no right or wrong, that this way might have more advantages in this situation, or that way might have more disadvantages in that situation. So that's how we decide. That's how a family member, I suppose, judges for themselves which response works for them. So yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say on those ones.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Very, very helpful indeed. Let me go back to Megan, if I may, as I'm particularly interested in TINA versus TAR in terms of alternatives. And I wonder, could you say a little bit about some of the problems that we see sometimes with use or non-use of TINA versus TAR, and how we might overcome them?
I think it's definitely one of the trickiest parts of 5-step. I know you're an expert in TINA and TAR, but not all of us are, Richard, and we all weren't at the start. So basically, often it's common, I guess, within sessions that family members will maybe feel helpless, maybe feel powerless, maybe just feel exhausted and not willing to explore what the other options are for them, and they just feel like there are no other options. The way I'm responding is the only way I can respond. I can't see any other way of responding that will work or be effective or in my particular situation. And I guess that's when it comes down to the skill of the practitioner to try to move from there is no alternative, which is where a family may be, what a family may be feeling, or feeling that they're in that position, to there is always an alternative. And it's the kind of skillful application of that within step 3 that excellent practitioners really kind of come to light in using those skills. And I think it's about saying to family members, I can completely understand that you may feel that there are no alternatives right now, and that the way you're responding is the only way to respond, but let's just explore other ways of responding, even not that it will be perfect, not that it will be some form of utopia or what have you, that the alternative isn't going to be perfect, but as Steve said, that there may be an alternative where there are potentially a few more advantages. Or we may explore the alternatives and actually decide that yes, the way you're responding is definitely the most advantageous to you right now, but at least you'll leave here today feeling really confident that the way you're responding is best suited to your needs right now in your given situation. And I do think there's real opportunities to promote self-care when you're looking at the kind of current coping responses. So when people are discussing the disadvantages to them, and yet they're feeling that they still want to continue with the engaged coping response or the withdrawal coping response or whatever it may be, that you then look at ways that they can manage or some of the disadvantages to them and how they can practice self-care to kind of alleviate some of those disadvantages that they're feeling from their current coping response. And as I said earlier, I do think there is huge potential within step 3 to promote understanding within the family, and why one family member may be responding in a specific way and others may be responding in a different way.
Thank you, Megan, very much. Let me just come back on one thing you said, as I thought that was, I particularly thought that was important, which is you're not necessarily trying to change somebody's way of coping. And it may well be that you work through the advantages and disadvantages of alternatives and current coping, and you realize, and they realize, that what they're doing is absolutely the most helpful thing for them to do in that situation at that time. And that's fantastic. The difference is that they've moved from there is no alternative to thinking there are alternatives, I've thought about them, and actually I think this is the best way for me to proceed. And that's a very different mindset. So you're not necessarily looking for behavior change, although that may be what happens, but you're empowering people to realize that they have choices, and actually what they're doing is they're doing out of choice, not because that they have no alternative. Okay, that's very, very helpful. The only thing I want to add to all of this is just what no one's mentioned so far is about ending the session and the things that can go wrong with ending the session. And I think because step 3 is such an important one and there's so many important things to cover, I think it's also important that we remember that we leave time at the end to summarize the main things that have come out of the session, to remind people about what we're going to go on to, which is looking at support in step 4, to encourage people to look at the self-help handbook in between so that they can both go over what was done in this session on step 3, but also start to think about all the things that we're going to do in step 4, and obviously do all the practical things that we always do about contact and data next session and checking out on risk if we haven't checked out on that already in that session. Okay, thank you all very much indeed.
Sorry to cut in. There's another pertinent point that's just occurred to me about Tina and Tar.
Okay, and I think Steve, you want to say something about that as well, don't you?
Yeah, I think one final point to make really is how when a family member gets familiar with the 3 coping typologies and becomes familiar with the choices that they have and the way that they respond, it could potentially help them get a better picture of how other family members, for example, their partner or their siblings or their parents, how they might actually be responding to the person with the substance problem or the gambling problem. And I think it could be a useful way to preempt part of what happens in step 4, where we begin to explore with the family member how they communicate with other family members about the way they respond to the person with the substance or gambling problem. I think it's a way to perhaps reduce some conflict by understanding, well, here is the way I respond, and these are my advantages and disadvantages, and perhaps my partner, for example, sees it differently and explores those advantages and disadvantages or identifies them differently. And so that's why I do it this way, he does it that way when we're responding, for example, to our son. So I think, yeah, a good practitioner will make use of the conversation here in step 4.5, I believe it is, when exploring the ways to communicate with your own family members about your responses to the person with the issue. So yeah, I think this adds, it leads on to further steps, which I suppose is the beauty of the 5-step method. It kind of flows each one builds on the one before it.
Great, thank you very much, Steve. That's a very, very helpful additional point.
Richard, just wanted to add another point, just picking up what Megan was talking about, Tina and Tar. I think what occurs to me is that sometimes when we're working with family members, they will have received interventions previously, which will have taken a particular position on responding and coping styles. I mean, one of the things that I've certainly come across is a problem that can occur for practitioners is they're explaining about the 3 responding or coping styles, and the family member is saying, but I'm not responsible for what they do with their alcohol and drugs. In response to an engaged coping style, they will have either received an intervention or read about, I'm not responsible for the person's substance use or gambling, and feel a real aversion to an engaged coping style. And that's where often acknowledging that they will have received information or tried other coping styles, and to look at those advantages and disadvantages, and in some ways gently describing how we aren't responsible for somebody's alcohol or drug use or their gambling, but we can influence people. The relationship with them can influence them, and if sometimes when we change, the person can change as well. We don't have any guarantees on that, but it is about looking at how we can change what's happening. So I guess it's kind of counteracting if somebody's received a strong message about I'm not responsible for somebody's substance use. Also, people will come with often, sometimes a label or pathologized around particular coping styles. They talk about, I don't want to be an enabler. I've been told I'm an enabler, or I'm codependent. And that can provide a real aversion to a tolerant coping style, because they've received very strong messages that's something that I shouldn't do. And often we have to kind of look at the advantages and disadvantages, and giving somebody the opportunity to make that choice that in certain circumstances, being tolerant is the right thing for you to do for you in that situation, to let go of the labels of being an enabler or codependent, and almost, be able to let go of some of those sort of influences other people have had on their style, or being told that I need to withdraw with love. This is another aspect that people will have received sometimes if they've received some mutual aid help, and some of the fellowships talk about withdrawing with love is the way to approach an alcohol or drug user. And again, we need to acknowledge that people will have received information about how to cope and respond, but open out to the opportunity that there are many choices, that the approach, there are always alternatives as opposed to there is no alternative, So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Richard. That's a very, very helpful addition, and also just very helpful to remind us that the family members we see may well have received absolutely nothing in the past, but they may well have come into contact with lots of other ways of trying to help. And they may well have read about them or seen things about them or whatever. And so we need to be aware that will come in when we talk about coping. Many people will feel that there are certain things which are out of bounds or which they shouldn't do. There's lots of shoulds and shouldn'ts. And one of the things we're trying to do is empower people to move away from what they should and shouldn't, but to think about things in a much more open way, where there is no right way or wrong way of responding, but they're just simply alternatives with advantages and disadvantages. So thank you very much for that, Richard. And thank you all very much, panel. This has been incredibly helpful, and I hope other people will find it as helpful and as useful as I have. So thank you very much indeed.
So just to recap some of the main points from this panel discussion. The first 3 are really about the typology. So the first one is that practitioners really need to understand the typology and be self-aware of their own preferred style. Related to that, we need to be really aware not to allow our own preferred style to influence the family members' responses, either consciously or unconsciously. And thirdly, we need to help the family member be self-aware of their own style, their default mode. It's also really important that we don't tell family members what to do, but we gently encourage. For example, what else could you do in this situation? We need to encourage them to try active experimentation where they think about an alternative way of dealing with the situation, where the family member can then go away, try that out, and come back and discuss with us how that went. And if that didn't work, then try something else. So this active experimentation is really important. We need to always ensure that we ask them about the advantages and disadvantages of both what they're currently doing and of any alternatives that they can think of. We need to remember that there are always alternatives. There's never probably going to be a perfect alternative, but they have options. And what we want people to do is go away from step 3, realizing that there are options, there are alternatives, nothing perfect, but there are alternatives. We need to help the family member be aware of the style, the default mode of other family members as well, as that can help generally. It can also help with step 4 and to improve relationships and agreed communication styles. We need to remember always to be very practical in this step. We need to gain one or more specific examples, and we need to help the family member work out the advantages and disadvantages of the way of coping that they use in that specific example, and then the advantages, disadvantages, alternatives. And finally, as always, we need to set up the step really well. This step needs very careful explanation. So if you recognize all of these tips, and we think that's going to really help you deliver a very good step 3. As always, I'd like to thank everybody who was involved in the production of the panel and of this roundtable.